Hi, everybody. Welcome to SimiTree's webinar. We're really excited to have you here today. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We're going to let everybody get into the webinar, get their audio working, get logged in. As we go through the webinar, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the question and answer box. We would love to hear from you. If we don't get a chance to answer your questions during the webinar, we will follow up with an email. We will post the handout in the chat as we get going, so look for that here in a few minutes. It'll be a link to the handout for you, so it's easy to access. I'm Missy Gilliland, the Director of Learning and Development, and we're really glad you could join us today. I'm going to hand over the presentation to two of our great experts, Nick Seabrook and Eric Sharber, to talk us through solving the staffing puzzle. So Nick, why don't I hand it off to you?
Great, thanks Missy, appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're going to go over a survey that we actually collaborated with Home Healthcare News on earlier this year. For those of you who don't know, Eric and I do a lot of traveling, go to a lot of conferences throughout the year. And when Home Healthcare News and us first had a call, they said, what's important? What are people talking about still? And one of the pieces that continues to stand out is the staffing challenges throughout the country. So Mr. Talent, Eric Sharber, is on the call with me, and he leads our talent solutions team at SimiTree. So that was definitely something that was first and foremost on our minds. Myself, I have more of a consulting background, so I always like to say, all right, what's the impact of what we're faced with the staffing challenges right now? How does it impact operations? So we took a kind of a twofold approach to the survey this year. We want to continue to focus in on what's the current climate, what are the challenges, what are the success stories that folks are having as it relates to recruiting and retention, but then also what's been the impact on operations and how has the landscape on operations changed as well. So as we go through here, we're going to go through the results of the survey, the different questions we ask. Eric's going to kick us off going through more of the recruiting retention focus slides, and then I'm going to come on the back end, talk more about the slides that are impacting the clinical operations side, and then at the end we're going to have some discussion on some recommendations that we have for you all to have a successful operation. So as we go through here, like Missy said, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. There's a copy of this presentation in the chat as well for those of you who are want to follow along that way too. So I'll kick it off over to Eric.
Great, thanks Nick. Thanks for the intro there. Welcome everybody. Glad to have you. I'm Eric Sharber, again one of the managing principals here at SimiTree with Nick, and we're going to get right into it. We're going to try to keep this around 30 minutes. It's going to be fast and furious. There's zero chance that we could solve the staffing problem in 30 minutes, so bear with us a little bit. We're going to share some of the benchmarks, or not benchmarks, not really the right word, some of the results this survey kicked back to us, so that you know what your colleagues in the industry are saying about what their challenges are and kind of where they're at. You can compare your organization or the feelings that you're having around workforce and how it reflects to operations with maybe your competition or just other colleagues in the space. So we're going to go through these results kind of fast, as Nick said, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some best practices at the end. So this first little question was the outlook. How's your outlook changed in the last 6 months? And we thought this was interesting. If you look at the results and you really sort of narrow it down to, improved somewhat, improved dramatically, worsened somewhat, worsened dramatically, or stayed the same, it's roughly a third. So you've got an equal divide between people saying things haven't changed much, things have gotten worse, or things have gotten better. I think the interesting part about that is that I bet that there's a little bit of a boost from people saying things have gotten better because of this sort of post-COVID era we're in, and folks remembering how crazy things were just a year or so ago, right? And so they might feel that things have gotten better. The work that we're doing from a recruiting standpoint, what we're really seeing is that things aren't changing, guys. Even the data around the Bureau of Labor Statistics and what it's putting out around numbers, it's not getting better as far as the talent that's available compared to the demand, the shortage that's there. And in fact, it's really not expected to get better for years and years to come. So there could be some folks thinking it's getting a little bit better. That might be kind of a geographic thing, or it might be, again, that kind of post-COVID boost. But those are your results. We asked another question on a scale of 1 to 10. How would you rate the current staffing climate in home-based care, 10 being the worst. And we see that average response of an 8. This is consistent to Nick's point when we're traveling the country and going to these conferences and speaking about workforce. This tends to be the number one challenge that organizations are dealing with. They want to grow, but they can get the referrals, but they don't have the staff to fill them, or they don't even have the staff to handle the size that they're at now, and they're actually starting to shrink because of the workforce crisis. And so the only thing that surprises me about this answer is that it's only an 8, because the conversations we're hearing from folks is that this is kind of unimaginable, kind of worst case scenario. So obviously, with an average being 8, there's some folks out there that are handling it pretty well, and we'll talk about some best practices that might help you be some of those folks as well going forward. Next slide, Nick. So as we move on, next question. This was really a ranking type question that we put out to everybody who responded to the survey. So 1 being the most successful technique to attract and retain talent, and 7 meaning the least successful, but maybe still valuable technique. But of these 7 kind of areas that were offered, a couple interesting things here. As we think about recruitment and retention, I think too often they get lumped into one bucket, recruiting and retention, when they are 2 very different things. We'll talk about that later. But as you look at these options here that you could have selected, many of these, in my opinion, are more retention-based compared to recruiting-based, right? Or some of them can fall into both buckets, but some of them are very specific to retention, in my opinion. And so as you look at improved flexibility scheduling, that's one that comes up every day. And especially as you think about the generational aspect of our workforce, we do a lot of survey work. We talk to a lot of folks in the millennial generation that's making up the majority of our workforce now. The things that they talk about they're looking for in an employer, the 2 most important things is pay them and then give them that flexibility and opportunities to advance, right? Those are the areas that they're really looking for if they want to join an organization or if they intend to stay with an organization. You see a lot of compensation related answers in this, and that's because the work that we're doing, we're hearing so much about the way we pay our staff, so much about the way we incentivize our staff. We're seeing organizations across the U.S. trying to be creative and do new things when it comes to their compensation models, especially when it comes to performance bonuses or any type of incentive pay for people that wouldn't normally have incentive pay, right? Your senior leadership has always had it, your sales teams have always had it, but clinicians, right? Or clinical managers or directors of nursing, things like that, where more and more organizations are offering these performance-based incentives so that they can earn extra income and maybe close the gap between some of the competition beyond home and community-based care. It's become a big thing nowadays, and I would encourage you guys to take a look at that. The one piece that just strikes me a little bit is that offer professional development kind of came in last on this particular question. To me, that's an area that organizations should be focusing on tremendously, especially with this up and coming generation, not just the millennial generation, but Gen Z behind them. These folks are looking for what's next for me down the road. How do I grow professionally so that I can continue to earn more, to step into higher roles as I go? So that's an area that I think it probably should rank higher, but in this particular circumstance, it's number 7. So, all right, Nick, next slide. So the next question, we talked about the difficulty that your organization has had, but specific to recruiting what we called administrative and management staff. Now, listen, we couldn't have 100 questions on this survey. If we could, I would have preferred administrative staff and management staff be separate questions, right, on the survey, but we kind of lumped them together because what we were getting at is non-clinical roles, if you think about that. And so the difficulty folks are saying is that it's coming back as a 6. I personally kind of agree with that right now. There's been times through the work that we do and on a recruiting basis for our clients, when you think about management staff, has been dramatically more difficult than it is right now, especially again, during this kind of COVID years, things got really tough to entice people to move. At the end of the day, I think, this is a hypothesis, but I think I'm right on this. If you separated those 2 questions out and really did a pure administrative staff and a pure management staff, You'd probably see administrative staff be a little bit easier even yet, maybe a 4 or 5. And you'd probably see management staff, clinical leaders, administrators, be higher, be more like an 8. That's what we're hearing and seeing from our clients on a day-to-day basis. But that's sort of a blended answer of the two. Most effective ways to recruit staff in your organization. So this is interesting. I love this question, and it's very telling that online job postings are what most folks are using to find staff. That's because from a time standpoint, investment in your team and your recruiters team is probably the most efficient way to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do it. It's what's producing the most candidates, I believe, because it's the thing that most organizations are using. There's also a cost piece to this. So if you think about, and it wasn't reflected in this question, what are the most effective means of recruiting in your organization? And online job postings comes out number 1 from these options given, but it's probably the most expensive one as well, right? You could do a really nice campaign on LinkedIn, TikToks, Instagram, social media, other forms of social media, and attract the right or the same amount of candidates as an online job posting if you put the effort in, if you build your network, if you do a really savvy campaign. But some organizations don't have the time or the ability to develop that network. But social media is free. Now, you can sponsor it if you want, but by and large, it's free. Employee referral programs. We know that it's probably the best way to find really great talent. We also know that it can be the most effective way of finding talent. But how many organizations have a really good employee referral program in place? And so my guess is that maybe 35% of the organizations out there have a really good employee referral program, and that's why it's only ranking at that level. So take this data with a grain of salt. My advice is cast a big net. You should have a great employee referral program, great presence on social media, and leverage those online job postings. But it's interesting to see kind of what most of the folks are using out there.
Eric, a quick question. And there's a comment in the chat box. I figure we can kind of respond to it as we go through here. It's a good point. The comment is, I would have thought social media aspect would have captured more that younger generation for employment rather than standard posting. Is that typical of what you're seeing in today's environment as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. So 100% you're right. And I will give you this much of the thousands of placements that we do here at SimiTree Talent Solutions and on a regular basis, it's well over 50% of the placements we make come from sourcing and leveraging social media. The difference is your ability to, you can't just have a LinkedIn profile and post you're looking for an XYZ person and expect people to apply. You only get out of it what you put into it, right? So you have to build your network, connect with people. Somebody has to own that social media presence within your organization. So if you have a good presence, if you have lots of connections, if you're involved in lots of groups, if you're active in the community, and then you post something to the person that posted that question, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at any millennial or Gen Z person as they're walking down the road, what are they doing? They're staring at their phone. And as they're staring at the phone, what are they doing? They're looking at social media. The other piece is, I think a lot of the generation that's maybe the older Gen X and certainly boomers, when they think about social media, they're thinking about LinkedIn and they're thinking about Facebook. Solid tools, really good tools. There's a lot of other tools. We've all heard about TikTok. Maybe not everybody knows what it is. It's a fantastic recruiting platform. So is Instagram. And I think so a lot of people are thinking social media, but they're not leveraging social media to its full capability. So you're absolutely right there.
Now, one other quick question, Eric, is for the positions that we fill, and this is another Q&A that just got posted, how many of those folks that we're placing are actively searching versus we're doing the reach out to them? Because that's another good point, is that some of the recruiting is taking place for folks who aren't actively looking.
This is why we're in business, quite frankly. All right, as a recruiting firm, this is why any recruiting firm is in business, because that 53% that's posting an ad, that's only posting towards active job seekers. And nationally, the statistic that's put out there nationally among all sort of staffing industry reports is that 70% of the talent pool is passive, meaning they're not looking for a job. So that 53% of online postings is only touching 30% of the potential talent pool. And so for us, for example, again, 65% of the placements we're making are coming from referrals and social media, things like that. There's only about 15, 20% are coming from ads. That's because we're diving into that passive candidate pool to try and find those really good matches to pull and attract to your organization. So you're right. If you just put a job posting out there, maybe it works, but you're only marketing to 30% of the potential talent pool. Okay, a couple more right here. I'm actually going to take just that bottom right-hand question real quick, and then I'm going to kick it over to Nick to talk about some of these other things. But we asked the question, which of the following best describes your approach to recruiting? And we see that most organizations are keeping recruiting in-house. Some of them are doing a combination, right? 39% of internal and external resources. There are a few organizations that are literally outsourcing, it looks like, and some that are using travel nurse staffing. I guess the point of this question was to see how many folks are having to leverage third-party resources to find talent, and you can kind of compare yourself to them. But the reality is it looks like roughly half of the folks out there, half the organizations out there are using third-party organizations. And that's whether you're talking about hiring a clinician, hiring a manager, hiring an executive. And that's very, very consistent with what we at SimiTree see. There are definitely organizations out there that leverage us on a regular basis. And there's a lot of organizations out there that are successful doing it in-house. Know, though, that those ones that are in that 51% that are doing it all in-house, you're probably talking about very sophisticated organizations that have some scale to where they essentially have a recruiting company built into their internal systems. And so don't feel bad if you're not one that's able to keep it all in-house, because that's very, very normal until you get the scale where you can have a really sophisticated recruitment function. So Nick, I'll kick it to you to talk about these other ones.
Perfect. So like we said at the top, and one of the other pieces that we wanted to look at is, how does recruiting retention, how does the landscape of that today tie to operations, specifically on clinical operations? So a couple questions that we asked here. You can see, I'll go to the top right question there, is more on the structure, right? We wanted to see, we know there's a lot of evolution in terms of job titles and what folks are in what seats for organizations. So we really wanted to see from a clinical management perspective, what are some of those titles that folks have? And we kept it open-ended so you could select more than one answer for this one. But you can see here's the list of positions we had. I did think it was interesting that not a lot of folks, or the low majority, use that chief title, right? If we look at chief nursing officer, chief clinical officer, only 22% of folks have chief nursing officers, only 17 have a chief clinical. A good majority of the folks who responded do have a director of clinical services. You can see close to 70%, and then 29% have VP of clinical services. So there's going to be folks who have multiple, but this just gives you an idea of what we see out there most commonly. I'll say the other factor that I think dictates what the answers were to this survey question in particular is going to be agency size. I would say as agencies scale and get bigger, we typically will see more of the chief titles. Whereas if it's a smaller organization, it may be a director title instead. Shifting over to the left question there, compared to 22, this is more specific on contract labor, right? So this is, kind of the reason why we asked this question is, if we're starting to see big swings in contract labor, this could be an indicator of either the job market getting much better in terms of being able to fill those open positions, or getting much worse. So a little bit more than half the responders said that there was little to no change. So the use of contract labor has been about the same. 26% says it's increased. Again, this could be an indicator that you're still having trouble, recruiting those frontline staff. And then I thought it was interesting that 20% said it decreased. So that, again, is an indicator to me saying we've done much better in terms of recruiting and being able to retain our staff. So we haven't had to use or leverage as much contract labor.
Nick, there's a couple just comments in the Q&A again. Yep. One was just talking about very few applicants posted for a DCS level position over months of time. And again, I think that goes back to your comments around the different titles that you could see. So experiment with that. If you're posting an ad, sometimes it's a DCS, try DON, try DPS, try different levels, try anything you could think of to change up the title of the job posting. That's a little tip of things that we do to engage candidates. There's another question about, are we seeing AI manage the community of social media versus humans for the activity standpoint? And yes, there is definitely AI becoming more and more involved in the social media campaign. It's also becoming more and more involved in candidate engagement when folks land on your website and they're interested in just learning about an opportunity. We have began using AI with our own talent, with our applicant tracking system, with our candidate engagement tool, only in the past like 6 months, and it's been good. So I would encourage you. There's all different levels of AI, all different levels of cost as well, but certainly that's happening, and it's going to only start happening more and more.
Appreciate that feedback there. This next slide, a lot of this is really focused on the onboarding process, right? And it's when you lose a staff and you have to hire a new one, what is that onboarding time? I'll start with the question on the bottom left, which is when you do bring a new staff on, how long does it take to get that staff up to full productivity? I'd say that's usually a number one question we have. Actually, Eric and I gave a presentation multiple times in the last couple of years on what the cost is of recruiting and retention. Not just from a recruiting standpoint what it costs, but also from a retention standpoint. For example, if I have a clinician who's 5 years experience and is providing visits for my organization, I know what their output is going to be, generally speaking, for their given year. Whereas if I bring on a new staff, we're going to have that onboarding, that ramp up time where they're not going to do nearly as many visits as that experienced clinician. So there's a cost associated with that, right? So one of the questions, again, we asked is how long does it take to get that new staff up to full productivity? I thought it was interesting that you can see in more than half the cases, so 56%, if you look at the 3 to 6 month range or the more than 6 months, 56% of folks responded that it's taking their staff at least 3 months to get up to full productivity, right? We have only 15% take less than a month, which is great. I'd love to know what those folks are doing from an onboarding perspective to get their staff up and running. And then, the most common answer was that 1 to 3 months. I actually thought it would be a little bit higher weighted on the 3+ months. To be honest with you, I think one of the other factors we're seeing nationally is as we're bringing on new folks, not a lot of them have home health and hospice home care experience, right? So they're having to learn just this industry in general, in addition to learning the new EMR, learning about the organization in general. So I was actually surprised there wasn't a higher respondents for that 3+ months on this one. But that ties into that top question, right? That top question is, what is the estimated cost to your business of losing a key employee then having to onboard the replacement? This is a question we get asked all the time. I always ask Eric, what are you hearing? Because I get asked a question all the time, and I always defer to Eric on the answer. Typically, the common answer I'd say Eric gives me is it's about 200%, which you can see only 5% of folks responded 150 to 200% of base salary. 3% responded to 200 plus. The interesting piece on this answer, I think, was that just how all over the board the answers were, right? If you can see 34% don't even know what the cost is. We kind of talked about, you have the recruiting costs in addition to the onboarding costs, and then the lost productivity costs as you're onboarding those folks. So the numbers are all over the place. And I think, again, this is more of an indicator on the industry doesn't really know what the cost is to replace an employee. So that I would say is probably the most interesting takeaway from that question in particular. And I was surprised, you can see on the scale of 10 here, with 1 being the least disruptive, how disruptive is turnover in your organization? I would have thought this would have been a 10. And the fact it was only a 7 was again something that was surprising to me.
And Nick, just to add on the cost of replacement, just remember that there's real money, there's cost that's involved in retaining your staff and recruiting new staff and whatnot. And how you justify, spending that time, money, effort, resources to retain your talent is because understanding what it costs your organization to lose that talent. So those out there that say, I don't know, you should know. It's costing a lot of money. It's not real money that you can withdraw from an ATM machine, but it's hitting your bottom line and from a performance standpoint. And by focusing on these retention strategies and whatnot, you're negating those losses. And that's sort of how it balances out, and you pay for it, if you will, in the end.
Absolutely. So for this next slide here, I'm going to again focus you to the bottom right. So one of the thoughts I had is, all right, well, productivity expectations change then if we're seeing some of those staff getting up to speed so quickly. So that's the question there is, have your productivity expectations or requirements changed for your organization in the last year and a half? And for the most part, it really hasn't, right? 60%, they've remained the same. I did think it was interesting that 30% had increased and only 10% have decreased. Again, the reason I would say I'm surprised on that is just with the newer workforce coming in, and I would have thought that you would have seen either it go down slightly or stay the same. But you can see 60% of respondents it has remained the same. And it is interesting that almost a third of the responders say that it's actually gone up. So the other questions we had here are more specific to case conferencing. I'd say I was encouraged by the responses here. In general, I would say our industry has come a long way from a case conferencing standpoint, really that patient care management. The first question we asked there is, how often do you meet from a case conferencing perspective? The other encouraging thing that I saw here is that 95% of respondents are meeting at least twice a month, right? I would say, again, in the past, the answer might have been not at all, or it might have been once a month. You can see, but 95%, the most common being weekly, with a little bit over half the responders. But again, it's encouraging to see how often folks are meeting now. The other question was really the approach to case conferencing. Is it more a loose type of approach? Is it more structured? How robust is it? You can see almost half the respondents say it's a robust case conferencing process. Others say it's unofficial but effective. That was about 30% of the responders. 14% said we have an unofficial and ineffective case conferencing program, and then 11% said they don't have one at all. So 25% still have what I would deem an ineffective program, but you can see the encouraging piece is, I would say if you asked this question 5 years ago, you would probably have less than half the folks say that they have an effective case conferencing program. Now, 75% of the folks do. The other question we wanted to ask was, again, kind of tied to productivity, is looking at average caseloads. And you can see, typically we see between 15 and 25, or sorry, 20 to 25 be the average caseload historically. So we really wanted to see, is that still what we're seeing? Only about 40%, 39% have caseloads higher than 20 on average, so 21 plus. That is the most common response, but you can see the numbers are kind of spread out beyond that. 30% are between 11 and 20, 16% between 6 and 10, 10% between 1 and 5, and 5% NA. So none of those answers. So I did find it interesting that over 25%, 26% of folks have caseloads of 10 or less, which is much different than what we've seen historically. Could be, again, another indicator of just the greener staff. One of the other pieces that we wanted to look at, and something we're kind of hearing different, one of the question I almost would have liked to ask as a follow-up to this is, how does your organization measure for clinician productivity? But the follow-up I would have loved to see is, how are you reimbursing your clinicians? I would say we're starting to hear more and more folks change that makeup. Eric mentioned before in one of the previous slides on bonuses, and we've definitely seen a lot more with bonus structures changing based on productivity. We've seen some shifts from either hourly to salary or per visit reimbursement. So there's been a lot that we've heard from a comp model standpoint regarding that. But in terms of how clinician productivity is measured, for the most part, agencies are still doing it on a visits or hours per week or per day. So you can see about 80% of the responders said that, 11% said other. So maybe there's a factor of quality factored in there. Maybe it's more based on what your caseload is. And then 9% of the responders are looking at visits per month rather than per day or per week. One other quick anecdote I'll add on this is the other shift we're starting to see is, I would say historically agencies have measured visits on a weighted basis. So for example, if you have an admission visit, you're typically weighting it, 2 or 2.5 for home health. Maybe it's 3 for a hospice admission. We're seeing agencies shift away from that, where it's strictly based on visit counts rather than, the weighted approach. All right, Sharber, we're 30 minutes, but we can go through our recommendations here.
Yeah,
The
go
question
as
was, how do we solve the puzzle? That was the title of our webinar. So if you all can hang on for another 6 to 8 minutes here, Eric and I will go through these bullets on how do we solve it.
Yeah, so these are just some basic recommendations. There's lots more than this, obviously. The first thing is obviously making recruiting and retention a priority. And what I mean by that is that for years we've heard organizations saying workforce is our biggest challenge, workforce is our biggest issue that we're dealing with. But for years we've seen it go down on the levels of priority, meaning the shiny penny, whether that's a regulatory thing or a reimbursement issue or whatever the case may be. Those issues push down the workforce initiatives that you might have around recruiting and retention, or specifically the C-suite or the ownership or the top level managers, depending on your scale, delegate those responsibilities around those pieces to other folks. They make it an HR problem or someone else's issue to deal with. We're a people business taking care of people. It's the most important asset we have. Without our staff, we can't grow, we can't function, we can't build, we can't be profitable, right? Workforce, especially in this age we're in, has to be the top priority. And that focus has to come from the top. So I would say your top executives, your administrators, your owners have to be engaged and involved in the process of workforce management. So make recruiting and retention a priority, and also develop separate strategies. I mentioned that right at the beginning, that too often it's lumped into one thing: recruitment and retention. I actually believe that we have more of a retention problem in this industry than a recruiting problem. Obviously, we're going to have a recruiting problem just from a supply and demand standpoint. But if you could retain the staff you have, you could minimize the challenge around recruiting, right? Too often, I ask folks, do you have a recruiting strategy? Do you have a talent acquisition department in your organization? And most folks will raise their hand in the audience if we were doing this live, say yes. And I'll ask, do you have a retention department, or do you have somebody that leads your retention effort within your organizations? And it's like literally less than 10, 15% of the people in the room typically will say, yes, we have a formal retention strategy. You should. If you don't have one, it's a different conversation, but we're happy to talk to you about some best practices there. Because if you can keep the ones you have, you don't have to worry about hiring so many new ones. And the next one is becoming that employer of choice. This is about culture. This conversation today is not about culture. We could talk about culture for hours and hours and hours. But if you can't define what your culture is and you don't know that you have a really positive, good company culture, then you probably don't. You should do some work on it. You need to bring in a third party to help. We've helped a lot of organizations out as far as developing that employee engagement piece. It's such an important piece to recruiting staff. Then the word of the mouth, knowing that this is the employer of choice. And it's such an important piece to retaining staff. If you've got a really great culture and engaged employees, you're like 59% less likely to have somebody look for another job. There's tons of data around that. If you're not focusing on your culture, you need to make it purposeful. You need to get help if you need it. SimiTree as a whole, we did that. We even reached out to a third party to help us define, develop, and improve our own company culture. If we can do it, anyone can. It's super important to becoming that employer of choice. I'll just say one other piece on that is there's going to be winners and losers when it comes to talent. There's going to be people out there who have the talent and have the line at the door to come to work for you. It's going to be a lot more losers. The people who are winners are the ones that are focusing on that culture and employee engagement. Nick.
Yeah, the next bullet we have there is understanding the cost of turnover and how it impacts your budget. And a lot of this cost, we're not just talking about straight cost in terms of the recruiting the cost it takes to place the ad, the cost for the recruiter to do the interviews. We're also talking about the fact that you have lost productivity, right? And let's use some round numbers. Let's say your average clinician's making 100 visits a month, 1,200 visits a year. Well, if we have a clinician that's brand new and that clinician might be taking 6 months to get up to productivity, they're not going to be able to do that 1,200 visits a year. So maybe their number is only 800. That's a huge impact on your budget. Your cost per visit is going up, which is something we've seen nationally. We're one of the larger, if not the largest, preparer of cost reports in the home health and hospice space. And we've seen the cost per visit go up pretty significantly. That's attributed, I think, not only to the fact that clinician costs are rising, but it's also attributed to the fact that the clinicians aren't doing as many visits overall because of the turnover and the staffing and the hiring that we've had in recent years. So it's really important to really understand what the impact of turnover is for your organization, that your planning is appropriate. And then the last one we have on there is adapting clinical management practices based on staffing. What we mean by this is, as we do have these newer staff, or if you have a staff that is new, the majority of your staff, let's say, has been only employed for a year or less, or they don't have experience in home health and hospice, you need to make sure that they have the tools, whether it be, let's look at case conferencing, for example. Let's say your current practice is to meet bi-weekly. Well, if you have new folks who are new in these clinical manager roles, maybe it makes sense to have it be a weekly meeting. So that way that they're having more of this support, or again, you're giving them more of these tools that they need in order to succeed and really ultimately meet the patient's needs. So when we talk about clinical management practices, one of the other pieces too is productivity levels or caseloads. If you have, again, a more green population of staff, maybe that caseload number should be a little bit lower. So that's what we mean by adapting your clinical management practices based on your staffing, is considering the experience level as part of that of those practices adopted. So I know we're a little bit over, but Eric and I will more than happy to stay on for some questions if anyone has any, or if you want to email us questions, there's our contact information there.
I'd also say connect with us on LinkedIn. We like to push out, a lot of information related to workforce, both from Nick and I personally, but also SimiTree. If you connect with SimiTree and SimiTree Talent Solutions, we like to put out a lot of just thought leadership and from subject matter experts out there. So yeah, if you do that, that'd be great. And obviously, if you think of a question later, email Nick or I. We're always happy to jump on a call and talk through any challenges that you might have in running your organizations. I don't see any questions coming in. So we thank you guys for your time, and we hope this has been valuable. And again, if there's anything after this that you want to chat a little bit more about, reach out to Nick or I, and we'd be happy to do that.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric and Nick, for another great presentation. You will receive a copy of the recording and the handout in your email in the next couple of days. And like they said, if you have any questions, please reach out. SimiTree is always here to help. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.